This is the vlog for composition for our argument research paper. I'm doing it all in one, just so it kind of is more of a retrospective on the paper, kind of my research journey. So I picked a topic that I was a little bit worried about at the beginning, because I thought I knew a decent amount about it, so that has always kind of prevented me from finding sources in the past. So I was nervous, but I couldn't think of anything more interesting, and that's kind of what I wanted to do with this paper, was write something at least interesting. So I went with it anyway, started doing research, couldn't really find anything. With the help of my art history professor, I managed to find a book by, I don't know I don't know how to pronounce the first name, but his last name is Tatarkiewicz, and the book's called A History of Six Ideas, and that got the ball rolling kind of on some of my points that I would be using in the paper itself. Also combined with that was a YouTube video by the channel The Art Assignment, and she's a former curator who is now making educational YouTube videos about art. And this video is called Art Must Be Beautiful, but the difference between this video and my paper is kind of that hers was sort of to defend beauty while at the same time just highlighting other areas of art. So it wasn't really an argument, and she didn't really use specific works or explain the connection between different sources that she used. So I did pull some sources from there, some of the more classical ones that I wouldn't have found on my own. But we sort of, I think me and her sort of share the same viewpoint that art doesn't necessarily need to be beautiful to be good, which she kind of makes a little bit clear in the video in the beginning. So that video was also a pretty good jumping off point for me. And then the rest of it was just, the bigger challenges were finding works that would work for this assignment, or that would work to support the points that I was making. So I had to go on a pretty big hunt for works. I believe I ended up using one from the video, and the other ones I knew about or found on my own through research. One of them is actually from my favorite artist, so that one was kind of easy to put into the context of this paper. I actually started out with just finding a bunch of works that weren't necessarily beautiful, that I could use as an example, or possessed some kind of beauty, but maybe you wouldn't want hanging up in your living room, as I've heard a lot of people say about ugly art, or art with more grotesque subject matter. So I found a bunch of examples of that. I only ended up using about, I think, 8 examples in the paper. And I used a lot of them as my backup to examples in the paper, which I think is kind of what artwork is best at doing as an example, especially in this type of paper where you're talking about art. So you have to come up with a concept, something that someone said, and then back that up with works. Because a lot of people a lot of theorists, when they're stating ideas about art, have a tendency to not include any examples, which is fine, but for the purposes of explaining it to a more general audience, I think that was necessary. This paper was also kind of difficult because it was hard to find anything extremely concrete and fact-based, because it's almost a moral argument. It's kind of an argument on what part of our psyche we should focus on, in a way. So there wasn't much concrete information. There were only points of view that I could share, which I found kind of interesting. And it made for a more challenging paper, but I think it makes it a little bit more engaging, because it still gives the audience permission to have a differing opinion. Um, and it's not as kind of abrasive as something that's 100% fact-based and saying that there's a right and wrong answer. Um, which I know is not really the point of an argument paper. It's supposed to convince the audience, and that's, again, what I'm trying to do. But I think this topic is leaving a more open mind to the other side as well. So, with that kind of issue out of the way that I went about the rest of the paper. So I broke my points down into kind of two groups, 1 point in one group and one in another, two in another. My first, the two that were in the one group is kind of definitions of beauty. The 1 point is that beauty itself doesn't have a concrete definition. The second one is, even if it did, it has differing definitions between fields, which are often kind of explored in art. And that simple fact alone makes it hard for anybody to analyze something on a simply visual level. There's also a lot of differing opinions as to the definition of beauty, which I mentioned earlier, which kind of weakens the opposition's argument in itself while still being a point in my side. If that makes any sense. If it doesn't, I'm sorry about that. And then my third point is that art kind of serves a lot more purposes than just being visual. And it has since kind of the beginning of art, which I explained in the beginning of the paper. And then the opposition points that I used were that art is trying to sell something and that beauty is the most effective way to do so, which I refuted by saying not all art is really trying to sell something, though I do agree that if an artwork is trying to sell us an idea, it should have some sort of visual stimulus which draws the viewer in. But then again, not all artwork is purely visual. There's part of it that's not. Actually, a good chunk of it is like music, for example. I also tried to be, speaking of which, I also tried to be very inclusive of my definition of art in this paper. There's installation work, there's poetry, there's actual traditional fine art, there's some really avant-garde stuff, and there's actually a fashion show in there too. So I kind of wanted to subconsciously expand the reader's definition of art as well, which I think is kind of something that comes naturally with the topic, and that you should do too, because if there's someone who's going to be hating on ugly art, they're also going to be hating on something that might be beautiful but might not fit their definition of art, and they might not understand why it's in a gallery, such as a piece of poetry or fashion, etc. So I think the target audience of this paper, I was initially writing it for people who really didn't understand art, but then I realized that was probably not the way to go. I realized that the most effective way to kind of get this information out there would be to put it in museums. The only people who are going to be going to museums are probably going to be people with a pretty basic understanding, or a tourist, but that's aside the point. So if you're in a museum, you're bound to have at least a little bit understanding what you're looking at. And of course there's wall labels and stuff, so you can gather a better understanding through that. So my audience quickly kind of became people who understood art but still haven't kind of made that transition over into the world of appreciating older, more traditional, or more classically fine art, works of art, than some more avant-garde or different types of contemporary art that might not fit their visual portfolio. So I was thinking early on what this would look like as the multimedia project later, and there's a museum called Mass MoCA, pretty close to me, who does these flyers for different exhibitions at the museum. I'll actually go get one. This is an example. They're kind of little booklets, just bound really simply, just paper. But I thought this would be a great way to get information out to the public. So with that in mind, I kind of based the paper around, oh, this is going to go to people in museums. And it also gave me an idea for my multimedia project. So, and then, what have I not talked about? Oh, okay. So my archives and artifacts, I used, again, mostly works of art, talking about that portion of it again. But I also used some of the older primary sources that I found, which were mostly philosophers of the time describing kind of the art climate. I think in the paper I actually used Aristotle and Sehe. And that was a really interesting find because they were traditional manuscripts that were published as objects, and those objects kind of are documentation in themselves. And I thought that kind of made it a little bit more diverse when discussing archives and artifacts. That was mainly actually in the artifact section. Archives, I think, was almost 100% works of art. But yeah, so they that helped me diversify my archives a little bit more. What else have I talked about? Oh, visiting place. So I've actually visited 2 museums for this paper. I visited the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and Mass MoCA, which is this museum in North Adams, Massachusetts. Both are extremely, extremely different. So the Met is focused on classical works. It's got a lot of European works from the Renaissance, pre-Renaissance. They've got a lot of East Asian work. That was actually my favorite exhibit or series of exhibits. They've got a huge section of Egyptian artwork, and they've got a big section of American work. They've got some contemporary, some modern, and they've got also some Aboriginal, Native American work in there as well. So it's very kind of focused on older art historical works. And I wanted to kind of go in there with the idea in my head. A lot of people say all art was once contemporary, and I wanted to really go in there with that kind of mindset. See why this art was groundbreaking or different or special at the time, why it's important now. And that kind of gave me a sense of beauty standards at the time, which I was kind of looking for. And the particular difference for me was between Asian art and Western art. Western being Western European, some of the American works as well. And obviously they influenced each other greatly during the Impressionist period, but I'm mainly talking about works before then. So they were really focused on different types of perception. So I noticed in Western art that it was a lot focused on objectivity. So it's got a lot of repeated forms, repeated composition. You see a lot of, as my art history professor taught us, spiral composition in human body. So it'll be someone who's kind of arched over, and it makes them look a lot more like their emotion. There was a lot of focus on the human body, a lot of focus on proportion, a lot of focus on craftsmanship. So it was almost like the beauty lied within the subject matter of the artwork and the way that subject matter was presented rather than the artwork itself. although there was a clear focus on craftsmanship as well, which I found kind of interesting. But that highlight of kind of almost unnatural beauty made art seem a lot more objective. So they were kind of right and wrong, um, which was the case in a lot of art. They viewed a lot of things as either not artful or not good if it didn't sort of follow the traditional rules of composition, where there's kind of like a triangle to stabilize it. There's a lot of diagonals to draw your eye across the painting or the sculpture. And for a sculpture, it has to kind of have a sense of movement. As you move around it, it'll very much change. It won't kind of look like a static object. And those aren't really things that you see a ton anymore. They're things that you certainly see in art schools. They're taught to young artists. But work in galleries kind of purposefully tends to reject these kind of standards, and plays with different things. Like they'll play with subject matter a lot more. Um, they'll play with kind of your perception of what the artwork is a lot more. And this kind of shift from importance in form to importance in thought is a lot newer than you might think. Although there is a lot of historical examples of it, which I brought up in the paper, including the Eisenheim altarpiece, and I don't know if I actually used another historical one. And then East Asian was a little bit different. I noticed that they did have a lot of beauty and subject matter, which Western art kind of did too, but theirs was more focused on how that subject matter was arranged, whereas Asian art was kind of what you're portraying is the most important part, not necessarily how you portrayed it, as long as you did it in your own style. And I noticed that of course the styles are going to be similar, because artists are going to influence each other greatly. So one major thing that I noticed about the Asian art was that they depicted landscapes and people very similarly, and it has to do a good deal with the style, with large fields of color that kind of make things a little bit more indistinguishable, but it also has to do with kind of the idolatry of those subject matter in Asian art. A lot of the work that was there was from the Edo period, and most of it was from Japan. Some of it was from China. Um, so what you see is you see a lot of Confucian influence, which basically means your ruler is heavenly. He was given. In this case, it's going to be a he because it always has been. But your ruler has been given the mandate of heaven, so they have kind of the mandate to rule by the heavens themselves. So there's this sort of heavenly quality about these people, and the way they're adorned like gods. And then the landscape itself is depicted in very vast color spaces, and it's depicted in some kind of the same grandeur as these figures or as these leaders were portrayed in paintings or woodblock prints. And that's kind of hard to put into words. You kind of have to see it for yourself to understand what I mean. But the kind of comparison between those two shows that in their religion and their belief system, the heavens were kind of a presence on Earth itself, through nature, through kind of the way the world worked, the way society worked, and then it was also presented on a more physical level in individuals and your leaders who were given permission by the heavens to be in the position they're at now. And I thought that was really interesting. I had never thought about it that way, as to why kind of all of their artwork is really showing off one thing in the piece. But I guess through that visit, I figured that out, and I used that in conjunction with Seiha's Six Principles of Chinese Painting and Aristotle and Tatarkiewicz, I think is how you pronounce his last name. I used all three of those in my supporting evidence for not having one concrete definition of beauty, and some more contemporary examples of that kind of manifest themselves more in the second portion, which is that beauty standards differ from between disciplines. So, for example, I use Jenny Holzer's inflammatory essays, which are poetry presented as fine art, and she's an excellent writer. If you read any of her essays, you'll know that she gets her point across fantastically, and she does it with poetry. But in a fine art setting, that makes it a little bit difficult because you're looking at words on a wall and you're thinking, why is this art, or why this isn't stimulating my eye in any way. So I used her work, one of her works in that supporting evidence, and I used also the work of Damien Hirst, I believe. And then my second visiting place was Mass MoCA, which is very different. It's all contemporary art, so you're getting works from the 80s, 70s, all the way up to now. So everything looks a lot different than it does in the Met. You see things maybe with a lot of influence from more classical works, but it's all very new. It's all very fresh. So in there, I actually noticed that beauty still seems very important. For example, the work of Sol LeWitt, though it's simple, he's got, well, just as a backstory, because I never really mentioned him in the paper or anything, but he does these big wall drawings and these kind of I'd say like meter-sized objects, and they're all very geometric. They're all very clean, simple, but require a lot of work to pull off. And they're all kind of isolated from each other in that they all have one unique element that makes them different from the next. So he did a series of, this wasn't in the museum, but he did a series of cubes with sides missing, and there were 100 of them, I think, and it was all combinations that you can do of sides missing from a cube, and it's such a simple work, but it requires a lot of physical labor. But that's not really the point of the artwork. The point of the artwork is to kind of be this minimalistic, confined artwork, but also showing variation. His work is also very influenced by mathematics, which I think was interesting. But his work also kind of presents this standard of beauty, which I wasn't expecting really from an artist who was so focused on concept and who was so focused on making something very strange and avant-garde. But there were a lot of things that I noticed that were very traditional elements of form. His color usage was, he's a very fantastic colorist. His line work is simple. It's very refined. It's very limited. And I noticed that kind of seemed to clash with his sort of notion that his work was mainly conceptual. But then I remembered that a lot of his work was made during the 70s, 80s, and 90s, when people were still starting to grasp onto the idea of conceptual art. So his kind of work was a jumping off point, and there were a lot of more conceptual things in the museum. For example, there was a woman who basically recreated a forest in one of the galleries to sort of mimic her hometown, and there were a lot of unpleasant objects in there, which I thought was really cool. Actually, I kind of liked it. For example, there were 2 taxidermied alligators. There was some masks made out of bird skulls. There were these signs with crudely written words on them that kind of looked like they were straight out of a horror movie. But I liked it because it sort of it put you into a different environment, and it made you think a lot about um, why what influence a place can have on a work of art, and I kind of took that to the next level actually. So, but it was by no means traditionally beautiful, which I thought was cool. So, Mass Mocha sort of made me realize that beauty can matter, but it's not the only thing that matters. And I wanted to make that clear in the paper too, that beauty's not at all a bad thing. In fact, it's great. It's still one of the cruxes of art, but it's not the only thing. And it made me realize that a lot of work shouldn't be and can't really be discredited because it's not beautiful. What else is there? And then writing the paper, putting all that information together was really it wasn't really difficult because I had my points laid out basically from the start, from the proposal itself to now. Um, and I think my paper is laid out successfully. Um, from my understanding from the critique, the peer critique, the argument was convincing enough. Although the person who was critiquing me happened to be on the same side of the argument from the start, which is helpful because there's sort of that friendly bias, but at the same time, it would have been nice to know if I could have converted someone's thought, or at least made them think a little bit more about why they feel the way they do on the subject. Um, well, yeah, I guess that's everything regarding the paper. Sorry if this wasn't um, the most inclusive of all my information, but that was just kind of explaining how I found different things to use because I thought going into this that I had a lot of a bigger knowledge than I actually did. I realized that my knowledge was quite basic on this topic. And doing the research didn't really help me find necessarily good pieces of information. The research sort of was more of me finding good comparisons that I could use in the paper. And that's what really helped, I think, make my understanding of this topic a little bit better. So, yeah, I think that's it. Thanks for watching, I guess.